terror investigation. British police search for more suspects following a weekend attack in London. Papal prayers.
Lo Spirito doni pace al mondo intero.
The Holy Father responding to the deadly violence. Cutting ties. Several Arab nations are severing their relationship with Qatar. And petals from heaven. We'll show you the beautiful way Pentecost is celebrated in Rome. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, June 5th, 2017. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. We begin tonight with tragedy in Orlando, Florida. A workplace shooting leaves 6 people dead, including the gunman. Investigators say the suspect was fired 2 months ago. He returned today, killing 4 men and 1 woman before turning the gun on himself. It took 2 minutes for police to rush to the scene, but it was already too late. Police identify 2 of the 3 attackers connected to Saturday's terror attack on London Bridge. One is 27-year-old British citizen born in Pakistan. Another claimed both Libyan and Moroccan nationality. ISIS claims responsibility for that attack. 3 suspects in rented van used it and knives to kill 7 people. Police say one of the suspects was known to authorities, but they had no reason to think he was actively planning an attack. Officers shot and killed all 3. Since then, investigators have made at least a dozen arrests.
When it comes to taking on extremism and terrorism, things need to change.
Saturday's terror attack could have had an impact on the upcoming British elections. Prime Minister Theresa May is accused of weakening security by reducing the number of police officers. We'll have more on that in a moment. President Trump spoke with the Prime Minister to offer U.S. assistance in the wake of London's terror attack. He then took to social media, renewing his push for a travel ban. Correspondent Mark Irons reports from the White House. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. The president is slamming the Justice Department for taking a watered-down, politically correct version of the executive order he signed in March to the Supreme Court for reinstatement. He's pushing for a tougher version of the order to temporarily bar entry to the U.S. from a half-dozen countries and calling it a ban, a word his administration previously shied away from using.
I don't think the president cares what you call it, whether you call it a ban, whether you call it a restriction. He cares that we call it national security and that we take steps to protect the people of this country. It's real simple.
Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders reaffirms President Trump's call to temporarily halt U.S. entry for people from 6 Middle Eastern countries. The president tweeting this morning, "People, the lawyers and the courts can call it whatever they want, but I am calling it what we need and what it is, a travel ban." That, despite the administration previously denying the executive order was a ban. It would restrict travel to the U.S. for citizens of Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen to protect U.S. national security, according to the administration. The Justice Department has formally asked the Supreme Court to let the ban be put in place after it was rejected by lower courts. Those courts argued the order is motivated by anti-Muslim prejudice. The president's renewed push for the ban comes in the wake of this weekend's London Bridge terror attack.
I will do what is necessary to prevent this threat from spreading to our shores and work every single day to protect the safety and security of our country.
Trump's Twitter comments, by calling it a travel ban, risk undercutting his administration's legal arguments for the presidential directive. But administration officials are defending the president's terminology.
If he wants to call it a ban, he's the president, he's the chief officer of this administration, and he has every right to do that.
It's likely that the Supreme Court will hear the president's case to uphold the travel ban and decide if it's constitutional or not. Lauren?
Mark, will the president's comments affect the lawsuit?
Well, the president's tweets insisting this is a travel ban may actually hurt his case because some critics say he intends to ban Muslims. The president has said this has nothing to do with religion, but it is about terror and keeping the U.S. safe. Lauren?
Correspondent Mark Irons reporting from the White House. Thank you, Mark. Tonight, Londoners are turning out for a vigil to honor the victims. London Mayor Sadiq Khan has a message for the attackers who brought carnage to the Capitol. You will not win, Khan says. We will defeat the terrorists. Joining us now from London is Sohrab Ahmari, editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
London Mayor Sadiq Khan reassured residents that London is one of the safest cities in the world, and yet the country has faced 3 attacks since March, 2 in the city of London. Our president, as you, I'm sure, have been reading, has been tweeting and criticizing the mayor. He said, well, Khan had to think fast on his "no reason to be alarmed" statement. Is that a valid criticism?
It's not good to criticize a mayor of a city that's just had an attack. But on the whole, I think that the president is pointing to a wider pattern of European elites, not just here in Britain, but across the continent, who have a tendency to downplay the attacks. Whereas if you speak to people on the street, there's a sense that the state is not fulfilling its basic function, which is providing security for people. So in that sense, I agree with President Trump that European elites have to wake up about the terrorist threat.
Prime Minister Theresa May, who has an election on Thursday, says Britain must do much, much more to fight this kind of terrorism. How do you think she's going to do in this election?
But my sense is that she's going to be perceived as the steady hand in this election. So if you're a voter who's worried about security, you're going to go with the person that you know, who's the prime minister, as opposed to the Labour Party's candidate, Jeremy Corbyn, who comes from the very far left of the Labour Party and who has described, for example, Hamas and Hezbollah as our friends. He's not seen as a serious security person, and she'll benefit from that.
Do you think that President Trump, who here is doubling down on his travel ban today, do you think that that is an effective way? Is that something, a strategy that the UK should adopt?
It's fair for voters to say, look, who are we letting into the country? And that it should not be treated as an a priori crime, an intellectual crime, as it is by much of the transatlantic elite, to suggest that, look, are we vetting people who are coming into the country? Now, one of the downsides of the program, or what it doesn't address, is that many of the terrorists in these recent cases, both in the US and in Britain and in Europe, have been people who are native-born Americans, native-born Brits by citizenship.
Sure.
And a travel ban would not address that issue, which is why I think the Prime Minister here is quite right, that there should not be pockets of Muslims who live in European cities, have European citizenship, but who don't at all share the mainstream values of a Western society.
Very good. Sohrab Ahmari is the editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Meanwhile, Pope Francis offered prayers for the victims of the London attacks after Mass on Pentecost Sunday.
Preghiamo per le vittime e i familiari.
Francis prayed that the Holy Spirit grants peace to the whole world and heal the wounds of war and terrorism. Joining us now is Vatican correspondent Mary Shovlin. Nice to see you, Mary. The Holy Father is praying once again for the healing. What does this Pope have to say now about terrorism?
Lauren, that's right. It's once again the Holy Father speaking out to comfort victims of violence and terrorism around the world. His remarks this time came at the end of Pentecost Mass, as we know, where he prayed that the Holy Spirit may come down and bring peace to the world, that the Holy Spirit may also bring comfort and healing to those victims of violence and terrorism, which he pointed out struck once more this past Saturday evening in London, killing so many innocent civilians.
Britain's Prime Minister blames Islamic extremism for the attack, calling it a perversion of Islam, and said, defeating this ideology is one of the great challenges of our time. Now, Pope Francis has made very similar comments all throughout his papacy. How does he view the threat of these extremist ideologies?
Lauren, in these comments that she made, she would find a great ally in Pope Francis. We've heard him say this time and again denouncing the use of God's name to perpetuate violence and terrorism throughout the world. In Egypt, just a couple of months ago in his trip there, he was very bold in his remarks and said we have to denounce these ideologies, this religious extremism in all the forms that it takes. While at the same time, he said we have to uphold that difference between God and violence, never being able to use God's name to perpetuate violence. And he's calling on the world community to help stamp out this extremism in all its forms. And he said it happens because so many of these people are disenfranchised from the society, living on the margins. It's there that oftentimes people can be radicalized and convinced to do these horrific acts in God's name.
You know, oftentimes when we see terrorism in one country in Europe, that affects the security of all of the others. Have you noticed increased security measures?
Lauren, there was a bit of tension at Pentecost Sunday Mass, for example. Tension, I mean, in terms of anxiety levels. The attack in London had just happened the night before. Pope Francis out in the square the next morning with 60,000 faithful. We're also entering the summer season. Rome is overrun with tourists, and we know that some of these extremists like to target tourist areas, soft targets, if you will. Italy, for its part, we don't see any visible signs of increased security, but that doesn't mean there aren't invisible signs of security being beefed up as we speak. Those silent security measures that keep us safe. And the Interior Minister, for his part, the next day after the London attacks, had a meeting with the Anti-Terrorism Commission here, analyzing the terrorism response on all levels here for the country of Italy, beefing it up once more. Italy remains at its highest possible security alert. The only level higher than this, Lauren, is if the country was actually at war.
Mary Shovelin, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent. Thank you for your report, Mary.
Thank you, Lauren.
There is a lot going on at the Capitol as Congress is back in session for 2 months until their August recess. Republicans have been in power for almost 6 months, but their signature promises of repealing Obamacare, defunding Planned Parenthood, and reforming the tax code still have not yet reached the president's desk. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi is with us this evening. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. The number 2 Senate Republican John Cornyn has pledged that health care reform will get done by the end of July at the latest. And this week, the president is giving new marching orders promising big changes for the nation's highways, waterways, and airways.
If we adopt these changes, Americans can look forward to cheaper, faster, and safer travel.
President Trump unveils his plan to privatize the nation's air traffic control system, a move supported by the airlines.
We're still stuck with an ancient, broken, antiquated, horrible system.
It's part of the president's push this week to invest in infrastructure, including an overhaul of the nation's roads and bridges, but it may be difficult to pass.
The White House projecting optimism on having a package passed by the House and Senate this year is new because of everything else on plate of lawmakers right now. It wasn't something they were expected to push through, but it's something that at one point had bipartisan support. The environment has gotten so politicized and so partisan that it's not clear that it's any longer a nonpartisan issue.
The pivot to infrastructure comes as healthcare remains in limbo in the Senate after it barely passed the House. White House correspondent Sarah Westwood says Republican senators can't even agree on the bill.
There is no consensus on even the broad outline of what Obamacare repeal should look like.
The bill the House sent to the Senate would strip Planned Parenthood of Medicaid funds for 1 year.
I want to fully fund Planned Parenthood and women's health care.
Hundreds of people protested the president on the National Mall this weekend. But his supporters also rallied USA outside the White House.
Hopefully, as he moves along his agenda, people will see that he really has the best intentions.
A major distraction for Republican goals is the investigation into Russian meddling of the 2016 election. Former FBI Director James Comey will testify here Thursday in his first public statements since he was fired by the president. Lauren?
There is still a lot of work to be done for Republicans, and I've heard House Republicans blaming the Senate, but they have achieved several wins.
That's right. The largest one that you hear from Republicans again and again here on the Hill is the confirmation of Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, as well as they point to the conservative cabinet that also was approved by the Senate here. So now we're looking at health care, and there's talk that it could be passed by July, but there's also a lot of skepticism here on the Hill. Lauren?
Correspondent Jason Calvi on Capitol Hill. Thank you so much, Jason. Arab countries cut ties with Qatar, accusing the country of supporting terrorist groups and backing Iran. The decision plunged Qatar into chaos and ignited the biggest diplomatic crisis in the Gulf since the 1991 Iraq War. Saudi Arabia even closed its border with Qatar, blocking shipments of food to the tiny Gulf nation and sparking a run on supermarkets. Qatar is home to about 10,000 U.S. troops. The Pentagon says it's not planning any immediate changes. We're also monitoring a shift in allegiances in the Balkans. This is a view of Montenegro, the small country in the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Just joined NATO. The move defies Russia, its former ally, and marks a historic turn toward the West. Coming up, fallout from the latest terror attack, how it's shaping global response. And a Supreme Court ruling in favor of religious hospitals. It's unanimous. The Supreme Court justices agree religious hospitals don't have to comply with federal laws protecting pension benefits for workers. In that unanimous decision, the justices ruled in favor of 3 church-affiliated hospitals being sued for underfunding pension plans. 2 hospitals are Catholic affiliates, while the third has Lutheran ties. Joining us now is Kelly Jane Torrance, Deputy Managing Editor of the Weekly Standard. Welcome to the program.
Great to be here, Lauren.
So this Supreme Court decision, which we have right here, is 8-0, and Justice Gorsuch was not yet on board. What does this portend for the future of the court, if anything?
Well, it looks good. You know, over the last number of years, especially toward the end of the Obama administration, we had seen a lot of attacks on religious liberty. And despite the fact that, you know, religious liberty, it's right early in one of the first amendments of the Constitution, it's enshrined that religion does play a special role in America, and it does get some special, privileges. The Obama administration was trying to take those away and move towards taking those away. Now, in this case, it was actually some lower courts that had decided that, despite the fact the law says if it's a church-run institution, it does not have to follow the same laws as everybody else.
The pension laws, which are short-termed ERISA, E-R-I-S-A.
Exactly.
Right.
So that's the Employee Retirement...
oh, it's right here. I know. Income Security Act of 1974.
Exactly. And, you know, so I think it's good that the court is recognizing that you have to look at what the law says. And despite the fact that some people don't like the fact that religion has a special place in American society, the law says it does. And, you know, one thing I find interesting about this is they were suing because these groups were exempt from the requirement that pension plans be fully funded and insured. Well, you know, so pretty much every private company has to have fully funded insured pension plans. Well, you know what? The state and local governments do not, and that is actually a much bigger problem than this. You know, I saw some statistics that it's nearly $2 trillion in unfunded pension liabilities throughout the United States with states. So, you know, if people are worried about workers' rights, then maybe they should start looking at state governments.
I think that we are going to have you back on to talk about that at some point,
Right.
but I do want to move on and get some news of the day in here. Donald Trump has said that James Comey, former FBI director who he fired, can testify in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee. How important is it that the president is not blocking him? And is this part of some sort of communication strategy out of the White House?
That's a good question. You know, that was just announced today, and they had been debating it for quite a number of days since late last week. And I think really that President Trump wants the fewer comparisons that can be made between President Trump and President Nixon, the better.
Oh, Nixon. I was going to go with Obama. Okay.
So no, I think that, especially with, having fired Comey, a lot of people were comparing it to Watergate. I think he does not want to be seen as someone that is following that Nixon playbook. So I do think this was a smart move. And honestly, I actually doubt we're going to see very much new information in that hearing because Comey and his friends have already been leaking a lot of what he plans to say.
This town, I'm sorry, is a sieve. We know that. All right, Kelly Jane Torrance, thank you so much. We'd love to have you back on the program.
Thanks, Lauren. It was great.
Deputy Managing Editor from the Weekly Standard. Police want to find the thief who stole a relic of St. John Bosco. It was apparently taken Friday night from the Basilica of Casal Nuovo, Don Bosco, named for the town's most famous son. The Archbishop asks the bandit to return the relic immediately without condition. St. Bosco is known as the founder of the Salesian religious order. Catholics in Nashville, Tennessee are mourning the loss of their bishop. David Choby passed away Saturday night. The bishop died from complications after falling at his home in February. He was born in Nashville, ordained a priest in 1974, and served a number of assignments in Music City before rising to bishop in 2006. He was 70 years old. His funeral mass will be celebrated on Saturday in Nashville. Up next, young earthquake survivors. Pope Francis consoles Italian children dealing with tragedy. What's it like to have the Holy Father as your boss? Cardinal Peter Turkson tells me in an interview coming up next. The face of the church seems to be changing as Pope Francis appoints new cardinals from around the world. I sat down with Cardinal Turkson from Ghana, the Vatican official now who heads a new dicastery or department on integral human development. I asked him about diversity in the College of Cardinals.
The church has always been universal. Since the day that Francis Xavier traveled to the Far East to bring the faith to the Chinese and all of that, that brought already the Chinese faith into the church life. But, whether that faith was captured in church activity and all of that, it probably wasn't there. So what Pope Francis is doing is just giving visibility to a reality that's already there and present. So it's like to have every community, every Christian Catholic community recognize that it also matters, that, it's part of the church.
I found it fascinating that he appointed a cardinal to Sweden, and Sweden has 200,000 Catholics.
If they're all in church on Sunday, he says a lot. So I think the thing about numbers are not a crucial determinant.
It's about faith.
It's about faith. It's about essentially the presence of Catholics in any area. When, for example, he created a nuncio in Syria, for the first time a cardinal, he was sending a message to the Catholic community in Syria, battered, tortured, persecuted and all of that. Right. It's saying that, you still matter. We're thinking about you. We recognize, your role and your presence as a church.
Despite the fact that the Catholic population in Syria is very small.
With the nomination of cardinals, the Holy Father does more than simply, come up with a name from a particular place. He communicates his own personal care for, churches in areas, regardless of how tiny and small they are. It's almost saying to them that whatever your size, we still think about you, we still care for you, we still recognize that you're part of the universal church.
And what a wonderful message. So he has put a lot of faith in you. He's put a lot of faith in you. He's brought all of these dicasteries together. Is he a tough boss?
Yes, no, okay, I think I need to be grateful to God for the trust that Pope Francis has in not just me, but all the collaborators that he has. For having been a church leader myself, I know how important and serious it is to, repose in somebody's trust as a collaborator and all of that. And I think the first responsibility for me is to prove the Pope right. In wanting even to merge the dicasteries, is to prove him right and to prove to that this was worth doing and this is useful and this can work. So that's what we set ourselves to doing.
I know that you are very close to Pope Francis, that you work very closely with him, and I think that our audience would love to know. What is he really like?
No, he's somebody who, I think, who trusts, okay, who has confidence in people, and readily makes it known. He knows how to appreciate people and how to appreciate things, you know, for when he sees them, when their deeds are there. And that's very encouraging also for all collaborators. You know, working with somebody who knows how to appreciate your worth and your value and the good things that you're doing encourages you to also want to even take on some more tasks, you know.
So not only is he the boss of 1 billion Catholics, but he's a good boss to the Cardinals.
Yeah, the billion Catholics are there, but it's almost, you know, it reminds me sometimes, it's almost like I talk about billion and the individual, okay? The billion Catholics are there, but the moment he meets me or head of any dicastery, he's meeting a single individual.
Thank you so much. Cardinal Peter Turkson, Director of the Vatican Dicastery on Integral Human Development.
Thank you.
What a lovely man to talk to. Pope Francis welcomes children from the areas hit by an earthquake last August in central Italy. The children, 400 in total, arrived at the Vatican train station on a high-speed train. Pope Francis met the children and invited them to express their feelings, recount their ordeals following that horrible earthquake. Nearly 300 people were killed in the natural disaster. The Holy Father asked them to trust in God and in Our Lady. And finally this evening, a reminder for tomorrow morning. Vice President Mike Pence takes part in the 13th Annual National Catholic Prayer Breakfast in Washington. EWTN is going to bring you comprehensive coverage of the event. I will be there hosting it live, starting at 7 in the morning Eastern Time. I hope that you will be awake and will be able to join us tomorrow. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, I'm Lauren Ashburn. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We leave you tonight with a Pentecost tradition in Rome. Rose petals fill the air inside the Pantheon, symbolizing the descent of the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit. Good night, and God bless.